Hi, I'm Allie Janes, filling in for Jamie Poisson.
I'm announcing a historic action to rescue our nation's capital from crime, bloodshed, bedlam, and squalor, and worse. This is Liberation Day in D.C., and we're going to take our capital back. We're taking it back.
That was Donald Trump on Monday, after he called Washington, D.C. a, quote, lawless city and the crime there out of control. Less than a day later, some of the 800 National Guard members deployed by Trump began to descend on the Capitol. This comes just a couple months after they were sent to Los Angeles to crack down on protests against immigration raids. The White House has also seized control of D.C.'s local police, and residents of the city are hitting the streets to speak out against the takeover.
You can hear people banging, making noise as they want their voices to be heard. These people are likely residents in D.C. and they're unhappy with how their city has been taken over under federal control.
So what's behind Trump's military takeover of Washington? And how might this fit into his broader plans to assert federal authority over other major cities across the country? To help us make sense of all of that, we're joined again by Alex Shepard, senior editor of The New Republic. As ever, Alex, so great to have you here.
It's great to be with you.
So President Trump says that he wants to liberate D.C., but I just want to understand how this all started. It's been reported that this could have been sparked, at least in part, by the attempted carjacking of a former DOJ staffer named Edward Corristine, nicknamed, I am so sorry, Big Balls. What happened there?
The early reports, which are not completely filled in, are that he was basically leaving somewhere with I think his girlfriend early in the morning, about 3 a.m. And as he was exiting this establishment, getting into his car, he was sort of attacked by a group of teenagers. There were reports that it was an attempted carjacking. It may have just been that they were, they just beat him up. But there were pictures of it all over conservative media.
The infamous Doge Lieutenant Big Balls was just jumped in D.C.
Big Balls bloodied. The 19-year-old former Doge staffer beaten by a violent mob of minors in the
he was certainly left bloodied. He had a concussion. Obviously, this came to the attention of Elon Musk, who was tweeting about it very early.
A gang of about a dozen young men tried to assault a woman in her car, Musk says on social media. Edward ran to defend her and was severely beaten to the point of concussion, but he saved her.
The president was talking about it.
He was left dripping in blood. He thought he was dead with a broken nose and concussion. Can't believe that he's alive. He can't believe it.
And, it seems like that was one of the sort of two main drivers that led us here. The other was simply that Donald Trump was in his car, I believe, on the way to his golf course or one of his golf courses, and sort of passed by a homeless encampment and just decided that enough was enough and that he was going to step in and do something about the rampant lawlessness in Washington, D.C.
So how did Trump then use that incident as a springboard to take over D.C. police and send in National Guard troops?
Basically, I mean, he has the power to do this and has been sort of, let's say, kicking the tires of doing it for quite a while. I think that it's been clear that he's been looking for an excuse to deploy the National Guard in Washington, D.C. For a long time. It's one of a long list of cities that his administration has targeted for what is essentially militarization. So, he basically invoked his authority as the president of the United States because it is a district and not a state. Washington, D.C.'s ability to govern itself is limited. It relies very heavily on the federal government's largesse to supply things like, just monetary resources. And there are emergency powers that were granted to it within the Home Rule Act of 1973 that allow the president to step in the case of an emergency. So Trump, as he's done with immigration, has taken a sort of nebulous, and in this case, I think it's frankly ridiculous to call it an emergency situation, but has invoked emergency powers just based on the perception of an emergency.
We're talking on Tuesday afternoon. We're seeing some of those troops arrive in D.C. already. What do we know about how the Guard will be used?
Well, not a lot right now. I mean, we're expecting them to be sort of deployed throughout the city. Whether they do that for optics purposes or in areas in which there are high crime rates is yet to be seen. But if you look at Los Angeles as the most recent example, so earlier in the summer, there was sort of there were widespread protests over immigration and customs enforcement going around and trying to round up undocumented immigrants in LA. People were exercising their First Amendment rights.
Protesters setting cars on fire, dumping bikes and scooters on police cruisers on the highway. Law enforcement firing hundreds of flashbangs and non-lethal projectiles and making dozens of arrests.
There were occasionally sort of moments of property destruction, but mostly it was just pretty standard protest. Trump saw this, deployed the National Guard then, even though both the mayor of Los Angeles and the governor of California said that doing so is not necessary.
With our orders directed by the president, the Secretary of Defense has mobilized. Right now it's 4,700 personnel to protect federal agencies, our federal partners, and then also to protect all federal assets and federal facilities that are located in the locations where there have been demonstrations lately.
And those troops were then sort of deployed around Los Angeles, and they were occasionally sort of spread out, where there were protests, but for the most part, they were just kind of milling around in highly visible areas. I think the expectation is that's what's going to happen here, that the National Guard troops are there for the appearance of Donald Trump doing something about this horrible crime situation that he keeps describing. But at the end of the day, he's faced with the big problem, which is that crime in DC has been dropping quite steadily. It sort of reached a sort of a relatively high peak by recent standards shortly after the pandemic, but it's fallen by more than 50% since then, violent crime, that is. They just did sweeps, I think, over the weekend, and Carolyn Levitt on Tuesday afternoon said that
approximately 850 officers and agents were surged across the city. They made a total of 23 arrests, including multiple other contacts.
It's not because the criminals in DC are all, quaking in fear and hiding out because of this. It's just because the fact of the matter is that there's not a ton of crime.
This is only the beginning. Over the course of the next month, the Trump administration will relentlessly pursue and arrest every violent criminal in the district who breaks the law, undermines public safety, and endangers law-abiding Americans.
Trump, as you've been saying, obviously deployed the National Guard in LA in June. And he also did it in 2020 during the George Floyd protests. But how does that compare to previous presidents? Like how unprecedented is what he's doing with the National Guard domestically, against Americans?
Yeah, I mean, so there's sort of two ways to answer the question. One is that the National Guard has been deployed in times of unrest before. You could think about something like the Ferguson protests in 2014.
Governor Jay Nixon anticipating expanded unrest if the grand jury decides not to indict Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson, who shot and killed unarmed teen Michael Brown on August 9th. Governor Nixon activating the National Guard to assist the county police with securing Ferguson.
Obama, I believe, was supportive of that at the time. He sent Eric Holder over there. It's not completely uncommon. What is unprecedented is for the National Guard to be deployed in this manner when there is no emergency. I think in a moment of, crime is decreasing right now. There are not widespread protests. So to use the Ferguson example, right, the governor will occasionally ask for the National Guard to be deployed in certain situations. In California, the governor and the mayor of Los Angeles were both opposed to this. In DC, everyone with any power, very much including the mayor, Muriel Bowser, are against this. It's not done to quell anything. It's a symbolic show of force by a president who is privileging his ability to make public spectacle over his ability to sort of improve public safety. And I think what you're seeing as well is that, the talking to folks in DC, and lawmakers, there's a lot of anxiety over the presence of armed federal troops or armed troops with federal jurisdiction in the city. Understandably, there's a lot of anxiety about the federal government taking over the DC police, and there is also, certainly when you talk to conservatives, there is anxiety about crime within the city, but that anxiety is not really founded by most statistical evidence, and it certainly is not in any way warranted when you compare it to the historical use of the National Guard in the past. And I'd also say as well that in Los Angeles, there's a lot of dissatisfaction among the National Guard troops that were deployed there, because I think for the most part, when these folks are deployed places, it is to help. It is either to, in some cases, in the rare cases, gain control of unruly situations involving their fellow citizens. But for the most part, it's because there's a national disaster. They're there to help. I think what they're not used to is being thrown into a situation in which, the general public is, one, I think, very apprehensive about their presence. But, in the case of DC, I think there is a lot of resentment already. And they're only just showing up right now.
Talk to me more about what other Democrats have said on the other side of that, and also the mayor, Muriel Bowser.
Yeah, so I mean, in general, I think, as has been the case for a lot of issues, I think immigration being the most notable one, you're seeing, I would say, certainly condemnation of this, and there's a lot of Democrats that are out there that are calling it a sort of authoritarian power grab. Mayor Muriel Bowser, in her press availability yesterday, sort of made similar claims.
My message to residents is this: we know that access to our democracy is tenuous. And while this action today is unsettling and unprecedented, I can't say that, given some of the rhetoric of the past, that we're totally surprised.
The Attorney General of DC has been very, very outspoken about it, but he is a sort of rare exception.
Unfortunately, the president's characterizations of what's happening on the ground here in the District of Columbia is not consistent with the facts. We have seen meaningful, significant drops in crime since I was elected in 2023. When there was a crime spike, violent crimes have consistently gone down every year.
A few other examples: Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland has been pushing for DC to at least, granted full control over its National Guard again. But I think that Democrats are very gun shy around messaging about crime and immigration right now. And that there's a worry, I think, that if they push back too hard, they say, look, there's no data to support the rising crime here, that they will then get pilloried, right, for support, for being the party of lawlessness, right? And so they, I think, are walking a tightrope in terms of their messaging, where they're saying, well, this is bad, but they're not going as far as to push back on the premise behind it. And talking to people in DC over the last couple of days, there is a lot of anger about that, specifically about Mayor Muriel Bowser's response, that it has not been fulsome or full-throated enough, that it is not going after this as a sort of not just an authoritarian power grab, but and DC is also a very diverse city, so it's basically that its black and white population is roughly equal, and again, historically, the federal government's control over it has always been tinged with sort of patrician racial attitudes. And I think that there's a lot of anger about that as well, that the people that are going to be, sort of swept up in this, and you're already seeing this, from a lot of the sort of early videos that have been taken by people that are encountering law enforcement officers who've been deployed as part of this, is that, it's going to be a lot of black and brown people that are targeted. And, I think the Democrats have been very reluctant to talk about the fact that crime has fallen dramatically in Washington, D.C., that this is not necessary. And again, that Washington, D.C. is capable of governing itself. I think the other point that I'm also hearing a lot from people in the city is that, Democrats could, and, I think many people would argue should, have been pushing for DC to have full control over its own affairs, that it should have senators and it should have a member of the House of Representatives. And, very few Democrats are doing that. And, what you are left with is, a situation in which you've got a president who is essentially trying to find every emergency power he can and to wield that. And the city has been sort of left defenseless.
So, I mean, Trump arguably has had it out for DC for quite a while. In 2023, he said DC was full of
filth and the decay and all of the broken buildings and walls and the graffiti. This is not the place that I left. It's a very sad thing to see it.
Earlier this year, he signed an executive order to beautify, he said, the Capitol, in which he called it horribly run and said it was a nightmare of murder and crime. That order was actually cited this week by the National Park Service when they said that they plan to reinstall a Confederate statue that was toppled in 2020. But what do you think is, behind Trump's disdain for the city?
I mean, the sort of Republican disdain for Washington, D.C. is age old. I think that Washington, D.C. has been hated by Republicans for two reasons going back, we'll say roughly a century, which is one, that it is the home of the federal government. So especially after the sort of conservative movement took over the Republican Party in the mid-1960s, DC became synonymous with the sprawling federal bureaucracy that the Republican Party was increasingly defined against. But it also is, a city that has had historically one of the largest Black populations of any sort of large metro area in the country, and that especially as the party also sort of became more oriented against civil rights, that DC was hated because it is a very diverse city as well. And for Trump, who's a sort of bog standard authoritarian in a lot of ways, the kind of lawlessness or his effort to paint it as this sort of lawless hellscape is partly, I think, just opportunistic. That he's always looking for problems that are in need of a heavy-handed often militaristic solution. And so DC for him is one of those. I think the fact that DC is the mayor of DC is a Black woman is one reason why it is attracting his ire more recently. I think, I'm not the first person to point out that Trump tends to reserve very specific, usually insults for people of color and women, calling them, low IQ, stupid, incompetent, all these kinds of things. And I think it also, Trump just likes to see the military out because it reminds him that he's a powerful person. I think it's not an accident that, that he wants the military back out on the streets of DC 2 months after he had his big birthday military parade, because it reminds him that he has the power to do this kind of stuff.
On the note of just this, DC being a bit of a fixation of the broader Republican Party, broader Republican movement, I just wanted to play you this little exchange from that interview, infamous interview that Tucker Carlson did with Ted Cruz, I believe in late June. And just get your reaction to this a little bit, which is very topical.
Can I ask, you've been in the district a long time in D.C., so have I. And the city's way more dangerous, and Congress runs this city.
No, it's a complete crapple.
So I'm saying, no Iranian's ever going to kill me, but I could get carjacked here. And I just don't understand how the Congress could run this city and focus on the dangers of Iran when the city is like garbage. Okay. It's garbage.
But Congress doesn't run the city. We could.
Congress does run the city. It's in the Constitution.
It's in the Constitution, but they've given home rule, so it's a Democrat mayor who runs it.
You control the Congress.
I'd vote for it.
I mean, just give me your reaction to that. I mean, obviously they're kind of talking, using different mechanisms, but kind of talking about the same idea, right? About taking back control of DC.
Yeah, I mean, this is a it's a favorite talking point of Carlson's, this idea that diverse places are filthy. He's been talking about it this way for years. He called Jackson Heights in Queens, one of the most vibrant immigrant communities in the entire country, kind of disgusting many years ago. And so I think that, part of what they're trying to get at here is that, these are talking points that Trump also favors. It's this idea that Democrat-run cities where there are lots of immigrants and where there are lots of minorities are filthy, disgusting places. But I think that what Carlson is doing now, just to sort of more uh, innovative, not to give him too much credit, part of his rhetoric is that he's positioning this idea that that more needs to be done domestically in opposition to the kind of neoconservatism that has that for a long time was dogma within the Republican Party. So the argument that is being made by Carlson, which is also being advanced by people like Stephen Miller within the administration, is that the United States spends too much time, money, and attention overseas, and it should be directing that domestically. Now, this is, I think, particularly interesting because it's kind of a historically left-wing argument. I mean, it almost is reminiscent of Muhammad Ali, who said like no Viet Cong ever called me the N word, right, about not fighting in Vietnam. That this idea that we're spending all this time being opposed to things overseas and we're not spending enough time and attention at home. But I think the thing that is extremely troubling about it is the militaristic connotation, right? Like Carlson, like Trump, is advocating for a stronger military and police presence in American cities, and the goal is to clean them up. And he doesn't just mean trash, right? He's talking about people. They want to have this kind of militaristic presence on the streets of the United States, and that's what you see in Los Angeles. That's what you're seeing in DC now, and I think that I am fully expecting that there to at least be an attempt to do this kind of thing, in New York in the next 6 months. Presumably after Zoran Mamdani is elected mayor.
Just to your point about where this could expand to other cities, particularly to Democratic cities. The Washington Post reported on Tuesday that the Pentagon is looking at a plan to create a domestic civil disturbance quick reaction force, they're calling it, which would essentially keep 600 troops on standby from the National Guard at all times to be deployed anywhere in the country within potentially 1 hour. How could this, in your opinion, normalize the use of the military on American soil for domestic deployment?
I think you could argue that the use of the military has already been normalized by Trump over the last 6 months. But I think that does get to what I think is one of the big points here, right? And that cuts to Newsom v. Trump. It cuts to what's happening in D.C. It certainly cuts to what happens whenever Trump speaks about wanting to deploy the military in other places, which is that what he really wants is to have the military or sort of a sort of domestic law enforcement agency that is directly under his control. Now, we've already seen a version of this, right, with him, really making a point of having a loyalist at the Federal Bureau of Investigations, where he installed Kash Patel. He does not want to be checked in any way when it comes to deploying law enforcement or the military. And I think that, it seems very clear to me that this is based on two reasons, right? One is the fact that he spent most of his first term under investigation by domestic law enforcement over his campaign's alleged ties to a Russian intelligence campaign that was seeking to manipulate voters in the 2016 election, and also again to the failed insurrection on January 6th, where again that was ultimately brought down by National Guard troops who were deployed not by Donald Trump, but by his vice president, Mike Pence. And, Trump has very much seen the sort of numerous checks that are on the executive in the United States, and he does not like them. And I think that they have largely wanted, instead of trying to reform existing institutions like the National Guard, which again is not really doing anything here, you're seeing a real effort to try to alter and manipulate sort of newer law enforcement agencies, most notably ICE. So that the sort of big beautiful bill that passed last month, had billions of dollars in it for a huge expansion of ICE, which is more responsive, I think, to the president's whims. And then with this sort of response force now, I think you're also seeing sort of goal of having another version of it. And again, part of this is that National Guard troops did not sign up to engage in a kind of symbolic show of force against their fellow American citizens, right? And Trump wants a sort of group of hardline loyalists. He sees ICE as being that, but that's clearly not enough. And I think they're looking at the National Guard that was deployed in LA, the one that's deployed in DC, and saying that that's not enough either. And I think that really the sort of ultimate goal here is to create, a kind of militarized branch of law enforcement that is, wholly loyal to the president.
Okay, Alex, as always, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, that is all for today. I'm Allie Janes. Thanks so much for listening to Front Burner, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.